Hi, I'm Marlow Melodies. Welcome to Gear4music Synths and Tech channel. If you use plugins, it is very likely you have come across the plugins made by Arturia. We are very, very proud to have been joined today by Edouard. And Edouard, you work for Arturia and I guess have done so for how long?
7 years now, I think.
I'm really interested to talk to you because people will know that Arturia have produced plugins for many years, but I wonder, have people ever considered how plugins are made?
Well, I will enjoy talking about a bit about this with you. There are some secrets I can't really reveal, but I'm joking.
Okay.
I will tell you as much as I can.
Okay. So what is your official role there?
Well, I'm product manager. Initially, I started as a tech support guy, and knowing the products really well and the customers, it made sense at some point to work for product management. So product management, maybe I can summarize what's the role. So basically, instead of managing people, you manage products. And this is from the very beginning, finding the ideas and proposing them to the direction. So to do that, you need to know the market very well, the competitors and the users. So looking around, if you're lucky and you can find ideas of products that will serve the musicians in their musical journey. And that's basically what we try to spend more time doing. But that's actually what's the most hard to do, because if you're running projects, you need to find the time to stop, meet musicians, meet artists, meet beginners, meet studio engineers, all these kind of people to understand how they work and what could be their pain points in their musical journey, or what could they need, what are they missing. So basically starting from there, if you're lucky, you can find some ideas. And if you have good ideas, you need to sell them to the upper management, let's say. And if you do a great job doing this, they will say, okay, here is your team. You have some great resources to do it. You have a budget and let's go. So at this point, this is where you really get started writing stuff. And then our role is to write the product specifications, meaning you mock up the interface and you write each and every function and how the user interacts with it. Starting from there, you give this document to the developers and you say, you can do it, guys. And this is where they get started. Yeah. And later on, you start reviewing the prototypes. And what I like the most is listening to the prototypes, the audio engines, reviewing the sounds. And for example, in a V-collection context, if you're modeling hardware, you start doing A/B testings and validate each and every module so that it really sounds the way you want. That's really an amazing part of the job, taking the team together and listening to some filter sweeps for hours. And at the end, this is all about helping the marketing the product, telling the right messages and so on, and following the products until maybe the end, where if you see a product that is too old, that you don't want to update anymore, that feels like out of the line, sometimes you have to kill your own baby. Yeah, I don't wish anyone to kill his own baby.
Of course not. But I mean, you've not killed babies, but I know that you've updated babies. So you had JP8 V4. Is that a complete recreation? Is you start again and do everything again, or are you aware of I know how to fix 2 things in here, and that's what you do?
Yeah, in the V-collection context, I think the oldest engines are from 2004 or something. So the way it was made before, in terms of code, for example, was really less structured. And now we have a very standardized way to develop and code so that it remains very clean and easy to service. And this is a constraint, basically, that if the code is too old, you maybe don't want to keep it. And on the other hand, there was the engine. And in 2004, you remember the CPUs back in the days? You couldn't really afford what we can afford now.
Yeah.
And so if you add to that the experience we gathered in more than 20 years in modeling stuff and developing audio products, sometimes it just makes sense to rewrite everything from scratch. And for Jupiter 8, Jupiter 8 V4, this is what we did. We just tossed the previous product, came with a new interface, new code, new audio engine, everything. And this is where you can really make a difference. On the other hand, some users are kind of sad because their presets don't work anymore on the software. But this is basically a sacrifice that I think worth because the engine is really totally different. So even if you try to match some stuff, it will sound different, and the features have changed. So sadly, some users are a bit disappointed by this, but definitely worth it.
This is a stupid question, but like, how do you make a computer version of a filter sweep? I mean, in really simplistic terms, is there a way that you can explain like how they work?
Well, I can explain it in a very understandable level because that's my level of understanding. So basically, in the company, we have different departments, and some departments are really pure software development. So they make the architecture of the plugin, meaning you have different modules, they cable everything together, they implement the modulation systems, the GUI, put everything together. So I can continue giving concrete examples. If you're building a car, software developers will build like the everything except the engine.
Right.
And then what you asked for is how do you do the audio engine, basically. And this is a special department called DSP. So they are specialized in digital signal processing. And these guys, well, they like mathematics, they are really smart, and most of the time they have a PhD.
Okay.
And their work basically is to do code that is specialized in audio. Depending on the context, they will make pure creation, like code-based, like modules, for example, a filter or an envelope or an oscillator. And in the context of the collection, where we will create synthesizers, well, they will do software models of synthesizers. So there are different granularities in this job. For example, if you have like modules that are really simple and pretty linear, meaning that work as they should work in theory, well, you can just build little blocks and putting them together. Then you just validate, well, this is the oscillator, this is the envelope, this is the filter. But sometimes it gets more complicated. Let's say for a buchla, for example, which is pretty nonlinear, meaning that in theory it should behave like this, but in reality it behaves like this. In those contexts, well, maybe you need to build blocks all together because they interact together, they're coupled in some ways. So this is why it gets really, really more complicated. And in this context, well, the more accurate you want to be, maybe the more accurate you want to reproduce everything in a single box. And this is where your CPU starts crying, but where the sound can get really interesting because it's like kind of the opposite of a digital module. Let's say that behaves really like very theoretically and not really organically, if I can say that.
Is it your job to sort of be able to tell the DSP engineers when they're not getting it right? Because are they musicians? Will they sort of say, hey, it's doing the thing, but once you put it all together within the whole synth, perhaps you suddenly realize, hey, this isn't all working together, and I don't know how you manage that.
Like historically, I think DSP engineers back in the days were really doing their thing and delivering the deliverables, and we were just implementing them. But the more the company is structured and the more we had the infrastructure to listen properly, like listening studios and all this kind of stuff, well, we started realizing that the perspective of someone developing is much different than someone who just come and listens. And it's like, if you listen to the same details because you have problems resolving a very particular thing in your code or in your model, where sometimes there are obvious stuff that you will miss because you're just you have so much focus on very specific stuff that you have a kind of strong bias. So a few years ago, I started to do like some groups in the teams where I would take like one tester, one DSP engineer, the product manager, sometimes someone else, like a sound designer, for example, because they have good ears as well. And what we do now is when we work on some modules, we get in a room together, basically in the listening studios, where you have proper like acoustics and stuff, and we just review the modules all together. And we all take notes, so that we have different perspectives when listening. And it appeared to really, really work out really well, and having like really different ears and different like point of views. And at the end, we just repeat the operation many, many times until you're like, can you play again? Yeah, okay, I'm playing again. Like, are you playing the software or the hardware? I say, the hardware. I know it was the software. I'm like, okay.
We're good.
This is why it starts to be really good,
I'm struck by, like, I remember we were talking when you were developing Juno V.
Yeah.
Or Jun 6V, I should say.
Jun 6V.
Jun 6V. I have a Juno 60, and that was the first time that there'd been an Arturia plugin where I was really familiar with the actual instrument. And I remember playing with the beta version, and my initial reaction, I was like, oh my goodness, like this is really close. But then when I started to do some really intense resonance stuff, I was like, well, maybe this is a bit different. And I started to kind of diverge in my own sort of opinion of it. But then what I did was I got my actual Juno, and I took the time to match like the sound, not the settings because they never match, but the sounds as closely as I could. And I was like flipping between a key step and the Juno. And as I listened back to the tests, as you said, there was a point where what was really interesting was I was like, there might be a difference. I'm hearing differences still, but I can't tell you which one is the Juno. So the differences kind of even out. And I wonder if it's that part of that difficulty of listening tests is if they're not blind. And I think there's so much kind of expectation and kind of baggage. It's really interesting when I get comments on YouTube videos where people say, oh, this doesn't sound anything like my version of this thing, or, that doesn't sound like I think it's supposed to sound. But I think we're so fallible, we're so easily influenced, and it's really hard to do critical testing. And I'm also, this is a very long-winded question, but I'm also struck by an example of how, for example, if you take the 808 kick drum, people have a perception of what the 808 kick drum is supposed to be, and then they actually try an 808. They find that, for example, the 808 kick drum does not decay for a very long time. It has it has a relatively long decay, but it's not very long. And people would say, if you had the 808 recreation, well, they might say it's not very good because it doesn't have the sort of super long decay that I expect, but that isn't actually real. And I suppose I'm curious, what do you think when you hear those kinds of things, like both the importance of listening tests and how well you conduct them, and also that difference between what people expect and what it really is like? How do you reconcile that?
This is when it gets complicated. Like, first thing, what you talked about in the beginning, sometimes you can match sounds, you can match really, really close. But talking analog, from one unit to another, you can have huge discrepancies in the way they behave, or just certain modules behave, because you have calibration issues, component aging, like what did the guy did with his synth, like storing it in his cave or blah blah blah. And you can have like different factors that are really, you don't really know what happens. And for example, we are working on some products right now. I can tell what it is.
But there are products, yes.
Yeah, and we started modeling our unit that we own, and at some point we sent a version to one of the guys we know in France who's like a super like a talented musician and who actually knows this synth really well. And he told, it's good. It sounds really, really good, but mine sounds really different. We're like, are you serious? So I sent recordings. It was like, yeah, I can't make a difference, but check my unit. And he sent me recordings. I was like, oh, where does the truth stand,
Yeah.
So at this point, you're just like trying to find other units and finding like the spot where it's maybe the better sounding or the better for usage, these kind of things, And the same person told me, I own a mini Korg, these like the 700 FS or something. And he told me like, I have a friend who has one, and he came to my house, he tried mine, and sold his because like his unit was sounding so good compared to his friends that the guy just like choked
it's just like,
and sold his unit.
what's the point?
And at some point, you end up making like choices that are not really that are like either it's feeling or either it's what's the best for the users, basically. And this is why it gets tricky, because when the classic V collection customer, like initially were the like really synthwave 80s fans that really are into analog synths, and then V collection became really a go-to collection for producers in general. There are a lot of young people right now that use V collection because it's just a lot of synths and sounds that you can use for your productions, and the expectations are different. So this is a bit tricky to handle, because sometimes you will make a choice that will really please the whole world of music producers, but a few people who are really into, I love this synth, it needs to be that way.
Yeah.
Well, they won't be really happy about it. So it's all about balancing like the truthfulness of the sound and making it like suited for modern usage. So there is no right choice, actually. It's just all about finding the right balance. But
it's important to say, like, there is no truth. Like, there's the only truth of vintage synths was how they were 40, 50 years ago, and no one can say now what they actually were supposed to sound like. Everyone's expectation of what is right is wrong. Because you can only have an individualized version of like an ARP 2600 or something, because they do differ. And I have like the Korg ARP 2600 here, and I've had people say to me, "Oh, it doesn't sound like my ARP 2600," which is probably true. But yours isn't the definitive ARP 2600, although it is to you, and it's really weird. I see that obviously there are concessions that you put to that by having like, there's a kind of wonkiness control on the Jun 6V.
Dispersion controls, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was a huge step in making the sound more alive, basically. And if you want, I can summarize what it is. But in analog synth, well, you have different voices. It's basically the whole circuit, like the oscillators, VCF, amplifiers, envelopes, and all these modules are like copies, so that each voice is assigned to a key press, right? So that you have movement on each key press and independent behavior of each voices. And what we noticed, we realized that it made a huge impact on the perceived quality of the sound and how organic it feels. Because between each voices, it's like between different synths, you have like discrepancies and you have like irregularities, you have calibration differences. So each oscillator will maybe have a different pulse width, a different pitch, like a slightly detuned between each other. The envelope times between each segments, like maybe the attack of a voice will be shorter than the other voice, but maybe the same voice will have a longer decay. And if you pair all these things together, like maybe one voice is more resonant, one is less resonant, all these kind of things, they make the behavior less consistent, and they kind of humanize, if I can say, the sound of the instrument. If you have like 5 squares playing at the same time in unison and something, you will have like this super UK bassline rees, or I don't know.
Yeah.
But if you just change the pulse width of each of the square, instead of doing like, it will do like,
Nice.
And this is the kind of stuff that happens when you bring in dispersion. And basically, it doesn't cost a lot of CPU, but really adds up. And if you play chords, then some voices will end before the others. Just one will stay longer, and this is why it gets a bit alive. So then sometimes you don't need that because you want something really straight and super controlled. But sometimes you like to have just a little bit of randomness, let's say, and like organic behavior in the sound, and dispersion really brings that to another level.
I think that's what everyone's looking for, isn't it? And the dream of analog is It's the imperfections. It's the sort of inaccuracies that we find so charming. I mean, often there's things like noise, which I find charming, but I know that some people are like, well, they get really annoyed that there's like a synth is noisy. Certainly, like inaccuracies are might help account for the differences that people find in their own instruments, but it's I suppose it's that question of how you find a golden synth. But I guess you're saying that you sometimes almost maybe create a golden soft synth by like listening to lots of musicians and taking lots of advice, and it's not just your decision. You ask people. You asked me. I remember like when we were talking about the Juno, and one of the things is that my Juno has had the Tubotech Juno 66 mod done to it. It's also 38 years old, and it's never been serviced by me. So it is necessarily, or potentially, very different to the one that you had, which was a Juno 6, I believe.
Yeah, I remember when you sent me some recordings, I was like, his units is weird, I remember you sent me like some super resonant filter sweeps, and sometimes it was like catching,
it wobbles,
sticking to the harmonics like in a weird way that our units were not doing the same, And I was like, what's wrong with these units? And some of the DSP engineers said, his unit is broken,
Which it probably is. And I mean, it's here, and I do need to take it to get serviced. There's a good tech like near where I live in Leeds, but
it sounded really good.
Yeah,
actually.
I mean, I love my Juno 60, and I think the plug-in sounds really good, and that's what I was saying. Genuinely, there's a point where when I may be in between them, I forget which is mine, and it becomes about the fact that there may be differences, but one is not better than the other, like magically, So it's an interesting conundrum, I suppose. Like one of the question is like, regarding filters and things. Do you use different techniques for different plugins, or is it all component modeling? Where you make a virtual version of the circuit? Because what you were saying before certainly regards Buchla is that maybe I don't want to use the word magic because that's not very scientific, but it's
cool.
It sounds cool.
It's cool.
It sounds cool, but the reality is like it sounds like there are things where there are circuits that are doing more than the components should allow. Does that make sense? Or is it just that you're finding there are clusters of circuits that interact in a complex way? And I suppose it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on component modeling and what's it's good for and what's difficult with it.
Yeah, well, I don't want to say too much because I'm not really into electronics, and I don't want people to say, this guy is really saying but sometimes you have a bleeding between circuits, which means that some of the components can interact with each other. So maybe one oscillator will bleed into the other one, so it can mess up with the phase, or some weird behavior can happen. And if you like have some modules that are really behaving that way, if you really buffer a lot each and every of the elements you're doing, well, you will never recreate those kind of stuff. On the other hand, it's like the CPU cost is less expensive. But if you're doing like big blocks and just modeling the whole circuit, obviously it will sound really, really better. But the cost in CPU will be much higher in some ways. And this is also something that is kind of frustrating, because sometimes you want to make something sound really good, but the CPU cost is just like out of the line. And you're like, okay, only the people who have like a 600 euros processor will be able to use it. It's a balance to find.
Do you have that? I know that like you use that thing of having like the divine mode on Diva. Have you considered having like a sort of hardcore mode where it will kill your CPU unless?
Yeah, well, a lot of people are complaining because of CPUs.
They complain it uses too much.
Yeah, well, a lot of people don't have a good computer, and in some ways, I understand their frustration. And we thought about doing it for our next V collection or something, but realized that the optimizations we could do were not significant in terms of CPU cost saving.
Right.
And what sometimes you need to do is clearly another model.
Yeah.
So this adds up a lot of work. So either maybe you can find techniques where you have room for improvement, but sometimes you reduce oversampling or these kind of techniques, and all of a sudden you have aliasing while doing some filter sweeps. And in 2022, having aliasing when sweeping a filter is not really acceptable. I guess some people wouldn't hear it. At some point, we try to make really, really state-of-the-art emulation, and we don't really want to fall into this domain. There are other manufacturers who actually develop plugins that are cheap and who don't really aim at doing the best emulations ever. But yeah, we definitely think about it, and I hope we'll be able to come up with something.
Another thing is that a question I had is is the limitations of developing plugins so much to do with CPU anymore, or is it as much just the knowledge of the DSP engineers? You've been doing this so long, you're surely just better at this. Do you know what I mean? You've learned so much about DSP engineers. I think of computer games, console games, where PlayStation 4 is announced and the games look pretty good. But by the end of the life of the PlayStation 4, the games look amazing. They look impossibly good. So do you feel is the limiting factor kind of CPU, or is it just the sort of I've put it away before of saying, is it the chefs? Is it or is it the ingredients?
Well, if you ask a DSP engineer here, do exactly the same, for example, reproducing a filter, it will say at which cost, And I think that if you include time and no CPU limit, you can do something that is just absolutely amazing, But then you fall in the territory of, is it worth it? It's like maybe in 40 years we still have petrol hidden super deep in the ground, but will it be worth digging so hard to get it? It's kind of the same thing. At some point you need to find a way that everybody's happy and not unhappy because it's too CPU hungry, So you have to balance. But yeah, definitely, I think someone could make a model of the most nonlinear stuff. If he had a super heavy CPU and the wish to just do the best thing as possible, he could do it. It would just take time and some power.
I see. There was an announcement. When this was filmed, there was an announcement yesterday that Apple have announced new Macs. When I mentioned my 2015 PC, but sorry to my PC, but I recently bought an M1 Mac, and my entertaining Arturia story with that was that I got the silicon beta of Ableton Live, and I loaded every plugin in V Collection at once and ran it, making sound at once. So I made a track that had 28 plugins going at once. The CPU was at 43%.
Oh,
and it was it was not crackling, it was still going. I was like, this is ridiculous. And they've just announced these new Macs that there's the M1 Ultra.
Yeah, I've seen that this morning.
The Ultra, I mean, they used a video analogy, is that the Ultra can run 18 8K video streams at once.
Wow.
So
this is unreal. I can't even, this is not scaled to my reality in some ways.
Well,
but
it's absurd.
That's crazy.
But I suppose then the question is to you as a product manager. I know that the reality is that you can't develop something that is only for those CPUs because very few people own them, and you have to make something that is accessible to everyone because that's A, it's commercially sensible, and B, it's also just it doesn't make sense that it's only available to a few people because not everyone has this big processors. But then, but do you feel that you may do stuff with the M1 that is not possible with other CPUs?
Well, we don't have really the intention to develop something that is just for these people who own M1, But it's like video games or something. It's all about a question of time. Like I don't know how did they do, but they came up with factories that were able to compete with Intel. And Intel maybe right now is a bit behind, but maybe in 1 year or 2 years they will do as good or maybe even better.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, well, the average of CPU processing will just grow, and it's just there is no like really big steps. I think this what Apple are doing is obviously like impressive, but it's also a lot of marketing. CPUs are always better and better and better, and then there is a matter of price, cost, and everything. You have like a GPU that are really insane, but you need to pay like two or 3K to have them.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it's really something major in some ways. Maybe it is because in a laptop or something they can embed like a very good CPU processing and GPU processing at the same time, which was hard. If you already purchased a gaming laptop, everybody knows that it's really bad. Out of this, I don't think it makes a huge difference in audio.
Yeah, and maybe not in the short term at least, but I think the way things are going, if that raises the sort of standard of CPUs that people have, then you can see a situation when in 5 to 10 years people just have absurdly fast computers. And it feels also the main thing with the M1 is it uses a lot less power, and so it's kind of the costs associated with the extra CPU power. The power costs are not a factor. It's like it consumes very little power because it's basically a supercharged mobile processor.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So I'm excited, but for now I'm happy that at least my M1 does run Arturia plugins like amazingly well. So I suppose it would be interesting to talk to you about like specific projects that you've worked on as well. Like I'd love to hear kind of like from you, what are the sort of the plugins from Arturia that we would know? Which are the ones that you are like most happy with? And maybe you could talk to us a bit about the kind of key moments and like the most exciting discoveries that you had when you were working on them.
When I joined the company, it was in 2000, it was 7 years ago, so 2015. And I was like the 26th employee or something. And now we are 141. The company structured itself a lot, all of a sudden we created like a quality department. Then we got infrastructure, like a lot of different things that just make work easier. And there's so many things that improved in the company, like when we rewrote the whole code of our software back to V Collection 5, if I remember well. Like we created our own SDK, so to standardize the way our plugins were made, so which saves a lot of time, which guarantees control over the quality and stability, easier servicing, and all this kind of stuff. So gradually the company put pieces together better and better, and as a result, the products we delivered were much better, like much more stable, like the quality of the audio improved, all this kind of stuff. And when we arrived in those facilities, well, we built some studios to listen like really properly with good speakers and acoustic treatment like proper. And dude, it made such a difference. Like between you're 4 person with 4 headphones, you're like, what? And you try to listen something, and then you have good speakers. The listening conditions are really good all around, so you can just sit, listen, say, yeah, no, more, again. All these kind of things matter, like really a lot. And of course, there's the experience. Like we learn from what we make, and we learn stuff at each different projects. And for example, when Sebastian started Pigments project, if we had tried to do that like 5 years before, the result would have been completely different, But working on hardware, on audio effects, on recreation of existing hardware and modeling them into software, all these competencies added up, and like Pigments, I think is a great success and really kind of surprised our customer base because we came up with something modern that plays in the playground where Serum, Massive, Faceplant, and all these great plugins are playing. I don't know. This is where I just like. I'm like, there's no real milestone. It's just like everybody ramping up all together to make something better each time we do something.
You've worked on Juno and Jupiter. I wonder if there are any like sort of Easter eggs or insights that you can give us, things that we should listen for when we try those plugins.
Wow. Well, Jup 8, I mean, this is a love story for me. Like, Jupiter 8 was kind of hard to fine tune in some ways because it's more nonlinear than the Juno. And I don't know, the filter behavior mixed with the dispersion when you make long pads, like every voices kind of drift from each other. And you have this kind of feature where if you turn up the spread knob, I think stereo spread knob, you have each one of the voices that are spread out in a panoramic like a space. If you have long pads, resonant, you add a bit of dispersion everywhere, and your pad is starting to travel in the audio field, and you have a voice that here is like this, but it's like more in advance because the envelopes are shorter, and there is one that is longer, it's on the left. All these things like come alive, and sometimes I don't really use it in a production, but I just like play it. I'm like, wow, or the first unisons with Jupiter where you had dispersion and all the voices playing the same note all together, but all in a different way. It's like another level. These kind of details, like maybe it's really nerdy because these kind of details really like I spent hours like just comparing voices all together, listening how they drift from one to another, this kind of stuff, because it's actually how the synth behaves.
Right.
When playing a Jupiter 8, you play a note, you play another note, and I don't know, the attack is different. One attack like clicks, and the other like is a whoop. It's all these differences make the instrument super alive and super organic to play with. Before we didn't do this kind of details. Well, the sound was cool, but now you're like, okay, it's really behaving like this dusty synth, and this dusty synth sounds amazing, like really amazing. You're like, now it's really close, and all this kind of weird stuff happen as well, And as a nerd, it makes a whole difference for me.
I think just as a sound designer, I played around with it, and it's when I mess with synths, I'm reacting to what I hear. I mean, that sounds like an obvious thing. I have an idea of what I might want to create, but ultimately I am also just responding to what I hear. And I know that like, particularly like the Jupiter is a good example of like when I started messing around with that plugin, I start like being curious to hear what I might do if I tweak this, or maybe I could push this a bit further. And it's that kind of excitement to see what you may discover that's kind of it's Definitely. A sign that the model is interesting. It's a sign that it begs to be explored.
Yeah, and another detail I noticed is when your model is good, this is where you are not ashamed to do simple sounds.
Yes.
And sometimes you're like, oh my God, I don't want to put modulation anywhere, or just a bit of flutter or, slight movements, like some kind of movement you would find in the CS80, that are really organic. But, a simple arpeggio, a bit of a filter envelope, and you're like, it sounds really good. And I don't really need effects, on it. And this is where you realize, I think we made a good job on this, Like this preset on Jupiter 8 called Simplicity, made by Victor Morello, is just a small arpeggio. And I think it's my favorite from the whole factory bank. And this is why it gets rewarding. You're like, okay, it's just a filter envelope, an arpeggio, just a tiny, tiny bit of reverb, and it's amazing, And yeah, these kind of details, you're like, yes.
Amen to that. Well, Edouard, thank you so much for your time. It's really lovely to talk to you and sort of get a bit of a peek behind the scenes. And obviously, we can't talk about things that are upcoming, but I am very excited for the things that I maybe do know that are upcoming. Like, the best is yet to come. So.
Oh yeah, I have great surprises for you. Yeah, like yeah. We are developing like a lot these days, and some of the new additions are. I think we reach a step ahead again. Like each time we release a new collection, like things add up, and we raise the exigence each time to another level. And the next things that are coming are like crazy good, to be honest. And I'm not trying to send myself flowers to the company. It's just purely objective. Like it's really, really good. And I'm really high. I can't wait. I wish I could tell you everything right now.
I can say that I have played with one of those things, and what I was saying about the whole just wanting to explore thing is like your listening tests have been paying dividends, because like I just want to explore those models. Like I just want to try them.
Yes, definitely.
So, yeah. Well, Edouard, thank you. Gear4music, of course, sell things. I would be remiss not to point out that there is a link down below. If you'd like to check out Arturia plugins, please check the link. For the Arturia plugins are available. And so you can try some of these wonderful, wonderful things that Edouard has been making, and hopefully future ones too. So, Edouard, thank you again so much.
Thank you so much too. I'm really happy to have a talk with you. It's really cool.
Same. So good luck. I look forward to your new toys.
Yeah. See you around.
Take care, mate.
Bye-bye.